All right, Jean Marie, I say we get started. There are still some folks entering the room, but we've got some housekeeping to do, so we should be in great shape.
Excellent. Thank you, Jamie. And Leslie, you're here. We're all together now. I am so happy to see everybody. Welcome, everyone, to Beyond the Blame Game, the intersection of religion, sexual orientation, and gender identity at work. We are really, really excited to be doing today's session, and I think we're going to have a really good time and get into some important conversations. So I'm going to do a super quick round of introductions, and we can get into this a little bit more. But as you can see that my co-presenters and I are all very prideful today. We thought that the conference probably needed some headgear, so we've all donned our favorite pride wear. We've got tiaras, we've got flowers, we've got fascinators. There's a unicorn horn coming later. But my name is Jean Marie Navetta. I'm the Director of Learning and Inclusion at PFLAG National. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, or if you speak Spanish, ella. I am also joined by my colleague, Leslie Funk, who is the Workplace Program Associate at Tannenbaum. She's going to tell you a little bit about that. Her pronouns are also she, her, and hers, as well as Jamie Henkel, PFLAG National's Learning and Inclusion Manager. Also she, her, and hers. And we are actually going to get started with a question before we even get into any other content.
Yeah, and so I'm going to be helping everybody to interact with our presenters today. My name's Jamie, she and her. And what we're hoping is for this first question, you can just send in sort of an A, B, C, or D into the chat. And so what we're wondering is, how are you doing today? Are you feeling like you're great, you've never been better, you're doing fab, and you know your presenters are pretty fabulous too? Are you B, doing okay, feeling pretty good, maybe could use some Botox? Are you C, thinking times are weird, you might be wearing pants, you're not totally sure? Or are you D, not totally sure what day of the week it is, concerned that there isn't a mimosa in your hand? How are people feeling? And it appears as if we're getting a whole range of responses, lots of B's and C's I'm seeing, a few D's, a few A's, but mostly B's and C's. So people are feeling okay, B's and C's, and I hope that we all have a better understanding of whether we're wearing pants sometime in the future when we're all allowed to be together again. So thank you.
As we're getting into theology and religion, I think that we can talk about it philosophically and say, really, do pants matter anymore? But let's, now that we've done our icebreaker, let me turn it over to Leslie to talk a little bit about Tannenbaum.
Awesome. Thank you both. Hi, everyone. I'm Leslie Funk. As Jean Marie said, I work at Tannenbaum. Just want to explain a bit about what Tannenbaum is, why we're a part of this conversation. And I also just want to add on to my intro by explaining that I identify as culturally Jewish. So this will be relevant as, of course, we talk about religion, religious diversity. And what I mean when I say culturally Jewish is that I like to practice my religion in the kitchen rather than in the synagogue. That has never been more true, of course, since you can kind of tell, maybe not, that I am in the kitchen right now. That is my work from home desk. So didn't expect it to be so regularly relevant, but here we are. So Tannenbaum, what is this? What do we do? So Tannenbaum is a secular, non-sectarian nonprofit. We've been around for about 28 years. The work that we do is kind of full of a bunch of lofty goals. We work to combat religious prejudice, and we strive to create a world in which differences are respected. It means a lot of different things. We do so through a number of different program areas. The most relevant for today, as you'd imagine, is the workplace. And through this program, we work with corporations, large nonprofits, government agencies to help them figure out how to address religious diversity in whatever way that makes sense for a company. And this means a lot of different things, a lot of different ways, the whole journey thing. We like to really meet companies where they are. And I just want to reiterate, we're secular, non-sectarian. So I'm not coming in order to promote any particular religion or religious belief, just acknowledging that religion is a really important and powerful force in some people's lives. So we should talk about it in that same way. All right, back to you, Jean Marie.
Thank you, Leslie. And quickly, for those of you who may not be familiar with PFLAG, or who may just remember PFLAG as where your mom cried for a little while, but now she's really good and at the Pride Parade with you. PFLAG was founded in 1973 by the mom of a gay man who knew that her voice carried some really unique power. And she decided to leverage that in the voices of lots of other parents. We have over 400 chapters around the United States that are dedicated to support, education, and advocacy. I just want to note that our chapter network, for the first time in nearly 50 years, had to shut down in-person meetings, but we persisted. Trust me, we opened up PFLAG Connect. So if you do need support, please find your local chapter by visiting pflag.org/find. Jamie and I run the Straight for Equality project at PFLAG National. It's been around for about 15 years. And it really was sort of PFLAG 2.0, whereas PFLAG is typically family voices. Straight for Equality very much was about the voices of our friends and allies. It also creates a space for LGBTQ people to actually learn what it means to ally to each other. And we are all about inviting people into conversations they have not had or been afraid of, educating them with resources that have been created specifically to meet ally needs, and engaging allies, because it's really awful to be told there's a problem but not be told how to fix it. And we believe in giving people direction on how to handle things. So today's session objectives, as we get into our content, first we are going to define and contextualize the lots of ways that religious and lesbian, LGBTQ and identities intersect at work. So what does it mean to see these two identities together, and what do we see happen? And sometimes what are we missing? We're also going to discuss the stereotypes and pitfalls that companies and employees must address and must become aware of in order to actually engage in this work authentically and effectively, because knowing ourselves actually is kind of the first step here. Then we're going to identify concrete next steps that you can use to have more productive, more effective conversations when we do encounter these two conversations happening at the same time and in the same place. And then you're going to go to work. So we're going to teach for about an hour. We've got 90 minutes together. And then we're going to give you scenarios. And all these scenarios are real world scenarios. And we're going to try to work these out using the skills that we talked about here. A quick few notes about content. I actually always need to correct myself when we get to this slide. We are not attorneys. Technically, Leslie is an attorney, but not a practicing one at the moment. So we are going to get into some legal issues, but that is not the primary focus of the session. If you are interested in RFRAs, Religious Freedom Restoration Acts, I'm happy to point you in the right direction, but that is not our primary focus. Second, there are limitations to data. We are using what is available. Not every country collects the same kinds of information. So where we can, we are presenting information. We're also not debating religion. I probably should have mentioned that I am a person who identifies both as gay and Catholic. I was raised Catholic. I believe in liberation theology. But we are not here to have a conversation about which religions are good for LGBTQ people and their allies and which aren't, or where you should be. If you are looking for suggestions, if you are looking for recommendations, both Tannenbaum and PFLAG have lots of stuff on that, but that is not the primary focus today. And also, this is really complicated. There's no one detangler, one way to do this work that's going to solve all of our problems and navigate all of our conflicts, but we're going to talk about strategies that we know work. One last thing before I turn this back over to Leslie, which has to do with terminology. You're going to notice in the research that we cite, it is phrased as LGBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQ+. We typically will use LGBTQ+ as two organizations working together, but we will use the language used by researchers in anything that we are citing because we can't change the content of the work that they did.
Great. And you've reminded me also that I forgot to share the other part of my identity that's relevant to this. I am a straight ally. So I think I've covered the most relevant parts. We'll probably talk about it enough throughout here so you all will not be able to forget it. So ground rules, these are things that I'm sure you're familiar with every other session you've attended throughout COVID and prior, but here they are again anyway. Turn off distractions. We want your attention. We know that's not always possible, but we would love it if we could have your attention anyway. So putting that out there. keep an open mind. Assume you can learn from everyone. We're looking forward to learning from you. We don't pretend or claim to know everything. That would be ridiculous. We are still human. And if you're engaging with us, which we certainly hope you will, we also encourage step up, step back. So if you're someone who typically talks a lot, like Jean Marie and I, then maybe take a back seat. Give other people the chance to step forward. And if you want to share, able to share, do so. But again, share that space when possible. If you're someone who tends to be quiet, what is your life like? And also step up this time. We'd love to hear from you. And assume that people are coming from a place of caring. This is a nuanced conversation for sure, no question. And there's a lot of feelings associated with it all. So we ask that where possible, really assume that folks are coming from a place of caring. It's definitely how we're approaching the topic, and we ask the same in return. And most important, more so than anything, we ask for you all to have fun with us. There might be some glitter and sequins in our homes, and hopefully that's somewhere nearby you as well. This is part of our headgear, part of our colors and everything. We want to have fun as best we can together, and this is our attempt to do so with you.
I'm going to throw COVID Fetty, which is shredded credit card bills. That was me having fun.
Okay, and so now we're going to get into the content of what we're doing. We'll take off our fun hats for at least a moment here. If we go to the next slide, we're going to start with the real fun stuff, talking about the conflicts we see. So we can't discuss religion and sexual orientation, gender identity without talking about and acknowledging the conflicts that exist. Also, my pride flag just fell down. Apologies, that's not relevant to this slide. It just happened. And so when we're talking about the conflicts, they exist. We acknowledge that religion and sexual orientation, gender identity have unfortunately a history and a current status of making headlines for all the wrong reasons, for the ways in which there are clashes, that people who are religious cannot be a part of the LGBTQ community and vice versa. And what some of these numbers look like around the world are what you can see here on this slide. And again, it's complicated. So what Jean Marie mentioned before about the fact that not every country allows for or enables this kind of data to be collected complicates what the data is that we actually have about different countries, different communities. But we wanted to reflect what the global conversation can look like and what ultimately the global conflict looks like as well. And going to the next slide, please. Back to Jean Marie, actually.
So as we also look at the global landscape for people who are LGBTQ, it's important to recognize that there has been tremendous progress made for many people in terms of just getting basic rights around safety and security. But this is just one way of looking at this map from ILGA only covers sexual orientation because gender identity gets a little bit more complicated as we look at the map because of definitions, but this is just a reminder to us that there are still many places in this world where it has become much more safe to be a person who is LGBTQ identified. However, there remain a number of places where it is very dangerous. And it's always important for us to remind people that the laws that we are looking at in some of these very dangerous places are not archaic laws that are not being used. They are laws that we are seeing being introduced on a regular basis and actually being put into action. And that's a piece of this conversation that a lot of people don't necessarily understand. So there is a lot of conflict that definitely exists around this as we look at religion and LGBTQ globally.
And this is a place where I'm going to come back in and ask folks to use the chat either in the Zoom client or on Pathable to let us know if they have had experiences like this. I think that there is likelihood that people will have responses that are all of the above, and that is totally okay. But we're wondering if you could share how this issue has shown up for you in the workplace. So are you somebody who, A, you've had a direct conflict that was specifically and explicitly because of someone's religious beliefs and or their sexual orientation or gender identity? B, are you someone who suspects religious beliefs or sexual orientation and gender identity were the underlying source of conflict, but it wasn't actually said? C, are you someone where programs offered by the Pride or LGBTQ employee resource group or business resource group at your organization have been protested or complained about under the banner of religious beliefs and or sexual orientation and gender identity, if you're here representing an interfaith or a faith-based employee resource group. Or do you feel like you can't talk about LGBTQ rights and or your religion and news stories in the office because you're worried about negative backlash? And it does appear as if lots of people are saying I saw that pop up right away before I even started talking through the answers. And lots of people are having multiple of these experiences. I'm seeing B's and C's. Someone said none, which is interesting. A's and C's and D. So people have a wide range of experiences here.
And I think that's really important to recognize as we go into this, that if you look at the way these questions are phrased, they're specifically phrased to assess not just what have your experiences been personally, how have you felt, but also what are some of the assumptions or the conclusions that you've drawn from different situations that are going on. Leslie, am I still talking?
No, you're done for now. I'm done. So in the responses that we just saw for the previous question, it shows some of what we're seeing here, that things are changing. And what that change looks like is going to be different for every person. So what we see here on the slide is based on religion as represented in only 2 countries as we could find, or as we could share with you, was showing the nuance of 2 countries, so the US and the UK, we see that things are changing, things are improving. And I also want to be clear, when I say things are improving, I know that that's not always the case. That's not necessarily everyone's experience for who's here. And I'm sorry, that, I see that I'm having issues with audio. It's okay. All right. So with that being the case, this is information that we acknowledge isn't universally applicable, but it is happening in some places. And with that being said, we want to show that there is hope. There are signs of change happening with time, and we hope that this continues to be reflected and continues because of information that we'll talk about next with regard to leadership and what leadership looks like as well. And we see that religious allies are becoming more visible across different communities. So some of the folks who are represented here, you can see the names listed, but Reverend Dr. William Barber, Father James Martin, organizations as well. Christian Role Models as an organization, and an organization called Iman. And these are organizations that are present in different countries also. And they reflect that we're seeing leadership, religious leadership in particular, across different faith communities, leading the way for change. And it's not perfect, it's not without challenges and nuance, and it's not without other issues as well, such as what does inclusion look like across racial divides, across ethnic divides, within countries themselves. But we're seeing that things are improving, and we're heartened, as so many other problems are being experienced around the world. We are heartened by this. Back to Jean Marie.
And there's another piece of the story that's really important here, and it is the reminder that we often approach this conversation about LGBTQ people and people of faith as 2 independent conversations, as though there is an either or. Either you're in one group or you're in the other group, but you could not possibly be in both groups. And I know we were scanning the chat as we were getting ready to start today, and people were already saying, I was raised as this, and I've left my community of origin. But this is a really big reminder. We call it the little reminder, but it needs to be in our faces that LGBTQ people are often religiously identified too. In fact, about 77% of lesbian, gay, and bisexual adults in America say that they do believe in God. And that's compared to about 89% of the population as a whole. So that's still a pretty significant number. And frankly, a number that actually flies in the face of a lot of people's assumptions. Stonewall UK actually did some really interesting work on the experiences of people of faith in the LGBTQ space. They found about 29% of their respondents say that they take part in at least one faith-based event every single month, and 17% said at least once a week or more. But it also reminds us there is also bias inside of communities. And I think I'm still talking, Leslie? I am. I never know when to stop talking, and that is the problem here. So because of these two groups coming together, what we often experience, yet we don't talk about, is the discrimination against people of faith who are also in the LGBTQ space. I often joke with people that it's much easier to tell people that I'm gay than to tell people in an LGBTQ situation that I happen to be a person of faith. That there is far more judgment on the whole for me on that count than it is sort of in a mixed group where I'm disclosing about my sexual orientation. So one in 8 people, and this was UK, have experienced discrimination or poor treatment from other people who are LGBTQ because of their faith. That include almost 1 in 10 people of Christian faith, 1 in 5 people of other faiths, including Islam, Sikhism, and Judaism. And there's a great example from Bloomberg, Amin Kassam, who's talked about having to come out of 2 closets, one as being gay and one as being a Muslim, and actually coming out with both of these identities and the challenges that exist in those spaces. And yet, for all of the progress that's made, we have to look at when we talk about LGBTQ and people of faith in workspace sort of situations, who makes the headlines? If I said to you, here are 2 religious leaders of big organizations, which one is the one who's always making headlines for talking about LGBTQ people? I'm going to go ahead and guess that for most of us in the US, we would identify Dan Cathy of Chick-fil-A, who is on record extensively and still, and let me be very clear on this, still very anti-LGBTQ. And has used his religious beliefs as the justification for how that organization behaves as a corporate identity when it comes to the lives of people who are LGBTQ. So he sort of becomes the example of what a religious corporate leader is. And yet we are not paying attention to examples like Bill Marriott, who is a man who is Latter-day Saint, so Mormon, who's talked extensively about his religious beliefs, and in fact, how his religious beliefs compel him to be inclusive of everyone inside of his organization, and most certainly his LGBTQ employees, as well as their clients and customers. And yet, when we think about religious leaders in the LGBTQ conversation, the one who will always come to mind is the one who is really pushing that sort of negative conversation. And it forces us to ask the question, what part of this conversation do we want to be in? Do we want to remain in the fire and brimstone and Leviticus and screaming at each other's faces and never getting to any sort of seeing each other for the first time? Or do we want to figure out ways to shift this discussion? And that is a conscious decision that we need to make and decide how we are going to handle that. And with that, I'm turning this back over to Jamie.
You are. This is another place where we're going to do just a quick A, B, or C in the chat. And what we're hoping you can share is whether you have observed or sort of experienced any of the positive changes, mostly that Leslie was talking about, when in interactions between people of faith and LGBTQ plus people and allies at work. Are you somebody who, A, yes, you have seen or experienced this, B, no, you have not, or you haven't seen it, or C, are you're not really sure, or perhaps you're not paying attention, that's, you know what I meant. And I started with lots and lots of A's, people saying that they have seen and experienced these positive changes. But more and more as people are seeing the question and reading through it, we're getting B's and C's, people who aren't totally sure or they haven't experienced this because of where they are in the United States or where they are in the world. And so, Jean Marie, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Or Leslie, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
I'll take it. Great. Thank you all for participating. It's really interesting to see the responses and just looking at the quick differences between A, B, C, or whatever the options are. So thank you all for that. And then when we go to the next slide, we're actually going to get into some more questions that are beyond multiple choice. So we created these situations based on scenarios that we've dealt with between PFLAG, between Tannenbaum, and they're not easy. They're not intended to be the gimme sort of scenarios where there's a clear right and wrong answer. So we'll start with that. What I'm gonna do, I'm gonna read it through, then Jean Marie and I are gonna share kind of like what we've experienced or how this comes up for us. And then what we wanna hear from you all is what you think might be going on. So the scenario, you can see here, again, I'm just going to read it out. A Muslim employee is ostracized by team members after she declines to attend an event hosted by the LGBTQ plus ERG. They assume she declined because she does not support her LGBTQ plus colleagues. So in this case, what could be going on here? Jean Marie, what would you say from your perspective might be happening?
I would say from my personal experiences, what I have seen is that people are making assumptions that the source of her non-attendance has to do with her religious beliefs. That is just my gut, and it's kind of what I have seen people do before.
Okay, yeah, and that's always a possibility. One of the other possibilities that we actually see with companies is that it could be that the ERG is actually hosting an event at a bar or with alcohol, and the Muslim employee may observe her faith in such a way that she's not comfortable being around alcohol. And therefore, she's trying to not make a big deal about it. She's just not going, just not making it a thing. And that could be part of her reason, or her only reason for not attending. I see that there's some, yeah.
One thing that I saw on the chat is she could just be busy. Like there might be something else going on. She might have another meeting. She might have to go pick up her kids. There could be other reasons that would prevent her from going, like social anxiety. Like it might be nothing related to her religious identity at all. So I wanted to throw that out there as well.
Yeah, definitely. I saw one answer that came in that it might be Ramadan. So it might be, again, that she has a religious event, or she has to pick up her kids, like has to do something totally innocuous, totally unrelated to anyone's identity that's represented in this scenario. So we mention this not to say, not to prove anyone wrong, but to really show that there are a lot of possibilities, a lot of assumptions that we're all making. And it's not a matter of who's right and who's wrong, but more a question of, have you thought of this? Have you thought of that? And we'll explore a little bit more in the next one too, the next scenario. Okay, so here what we have, we'll do the same thing. An employee has several times misgendered a coworker who's transgender and recently transitioned. And the rest of the team seems to be doing well with name and pronoun changes, but this one individual who is also very open about their religious beliefs seems to be struggling, and people have started to speculate about why. What could be happening here?
Well, I think when I look at this one, the minute I see people have started to speculate about why, that immediately is the red flag to me, because speculate implies to me that there's not necessarily any evidence on which they are basing their conversation, but maybe partial evidence. And I think the partial evidence that we have in this one, to me anyway, is this person is very open about their religious beliefs, and there could be a conclusion that those beliefs are incompatible with acceptance, although not necessarily stated. That's my gut.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's, again, it's a definite possibility. It's not something to be discounted as possible. It could also be that the employee is struggling with this change and trying to get it right, but freezes in the moment, sort of that fight or flight sort of situation, and just like falls back on what they know. I saw someone mentioned English might not be their first language, which is actually not an option that I'd considered. And it's a really good reminder of how language comes into play, especially when we're talking about multinational corporations, clients. Jamie, I don't know if there are others you wanted to highlight. I definitely didn't see them all.
Yeah, one of the things that I keep seeing pop up is lots of folks saying you shouldn't be making an assumption here. You should be having the conversation. You should be asking this person, what is it that's causing you to struggle? So I think there are a couple steps ahead of us where people are they're looking at this particular scenario and saying, you should stop making assumptions and ask the person what's going on.
Yes, and sometimes the most obvious is also the hardest, because who wants to have that conversation, actually addressing conflict? I mean, very adult. It's very overwhelming, I think. But it's also very important because it cuts across the speculation. You actually address the situation, and then we can move on ultimately. Yeah, so moving on in our session too, onto a question. Jamie?
Yeah, and this is a place where we are going to ask people to share a little bit more in the chat. So if you were to answer this question and send us a sentence or just a brief thought, in your experience, what are some of the immediate assumptions you find people who are LGBTQ and allies might be making when they interact with coworkers who have identified themselves as religious or people of faith? The answers are coming very, very quickly, which I love. And that people are making the assumption that you are definitely going to be prejudiced against me, that you're going to be judgmental, you're going to have some sort of superiority complex, that you're a bigot, that you're not going to support me, that you're closed-minded, that Christians are just going to judge me or condemn me in some way, that you are going to make the assumption that I'm going to hell. Lots of assumptions being made here. And so now we want to sort of flip that question and ask you all, what do you think are some of the assumptions that coworkers who are religiously identified or are people of faith often make about LGBTQ plus people and allies? And I'm going to give folks lots of responses from that first question still coming in, but so that they are promiscuous, that they are all going to be, that have HIV or AIDS, that they're all liberal, that we're sinners, that they are going to assume that I'm not religious, that I'm a socialist, all sorts of things, that you're against the Bible, you're against faith in some way, that you're liberal. So making assumptions about your religious identity, your political identity, and your life and health. A lot of assumptions being made there as well.
Well, the whole purpose of those two questions, you probably felt exactly where we were going with those. And that is about trying to understand what we are bringing into these conversations, because certainly Leslie and I can suggest policies, we can suggest rules, we can suggest guidelines, but ultimately it is how we approach every single one of these interactions that actually probably will judge what is going to happen once that conversation starts. And that is hard work. It is unconscious bias time. And I know we have been talking about this for a long time, but I think it is really critical around this conversation. And those two last questions are exactly why it becomes something that we really need to be vigilant about, constantly aware of what we are bringing into the discussion, the assumptions we are making about other people. I like to tell the story of one of my very best friends in the whole world, who happens to be a person working in diversity and inclusion. He happens to be gay. He was raised very religiously, conservatively. He is not now. And he talks about how walking through an office, if he sees religious iconography on someone's desk, his gut reaction is they hate him because he's gay. And yet he constantly is reminding himself that some of those very people have been his most profound allies. And so this becomes his job. And so I think on both sides of this conversation, this is not just for us on the LGBTQ and ally side, but on both sides, asking ourselves these questions. Where did we get our ideas about the other person from? And how are those ideas to this moment shaping the way this conversation happens? It is no secret that if you expect a negative outcome, if you expect to get into an argument, if you expect to be judged harshly by somebody, it is going to influence the way you approach that individual. And what might have been a door that we could actually open and maybe really sort of talk about how we can expand actually never opens. It closes before it even starts. And it's also important to remember that people's beliefs may change. And that is true on both sides of this conversation. And that if we assume that where people are today, if that is not where we want them to be, is where they are going to always be, and then start vilifying them and shutting them out completely with the way we treat people, with the language that we use, we are never going to be able to move the needle, because many people on this call, and I know that it is not just on this call, have these stories of transformation, of where people saw things differently, of where people understood the situation differently. But unless we are willing to try to change that fundamental first conversation that we are having, it is absolutely never going to happen. And that's a really hard lesson, because I'm aware where a lot of you are, because I'm there too. And it goes a little like this. I've been at this a really long time, and I shouldn't have to do this anymore, But the bottom line is that if I really want to see the world around me change, I'm going to need to do it because I can. Not everyone can. And I'm trying to see who else here is able to have those conversations. So with this, it brings us into our next section, which is about identifying steps that we can actually take to have these conversations better. And with that, I believe I'm turning it over to Leslie.
Yes, thank you. So one of the big things when we talk about religion and religious diversity at Tannenbaum is talking about the difference in addressing behavior rather than belief, especially in the workplace. And this might seem like, oh, isn't that a nice aspirational goal? But what it really does is allow for folks to take a step back. And rather than engage in a theological debate, which can go a million different directions and spiral totally out of control, it actually allows us to say, okay, what does the employee handbook say? What are the rules of engagement that my employer has laid out as how we're supposed to interact with one another? Ideally, there's some outline of what respect looks like there, and it's not just about personal subjective elements, which are important, but when we're in the workplace, our interactions are ruled, so to speak, by those employee handbooks and by those definitions of respect. And they can really allow for a fallback point, for a space to say, we may disagree, but at the end of the day, in our workplace, we need to interact in A through B, A through, I don't know, whatever letter, M, rules of engagement. And these are the things that we're told we can do. And inappropriate behavior looks like X, Y, Z at the other end of the spectrum. And here's what this looks like. And you're being inappropriate. And this is something that we hope that companies are doing and providing for their companies, for their employees, providing that space to say, you're not treating me with respect, you're not treating me appropriately. Maybe it's a matter of turning to HR in order to do that. But there ideally would be that support to address behaviors that are problematic, rather than getting at the core of beliefs that many of us may have and may disagree with one another about. If you go to the next slide, please. Can see some of the differences. And it might be obvious, but we just want to be as explicit as possible when we're talking about these differences between beliefs and behavior. We acknowledge everyone has both. We are human, we are interacting with one another. Things can change, and it might take time, and it might not look the same what change looks like, or how long or how short it takes to change. But again, the role that the company plays, the role that being at work and interacting with one another plays, it's relevant, and it really can change the outcome and what happens next. And we can see this in the next slide, actually, when we're thinking about what communities look like, what the world looks like. So looking globally, looking at the Philippines as an example, we see that 86% of Filipinos are Catholic, and the remainder, that 14%, is made up of folks who primarily identify as another type of Christianity or Muslim. Yet the same poll reflects that 73% of adult Filipinos agree that being gay should be accepted. And what that looks like in action might mean that someone who holds a certain belief of being Catholic is also, it appears, able to hold a belief and act, ideally, on the behavior of gay people being accepted. And this is something that it might not be the same everywhere. We acknowledge that. Again, humans. We're all different from one another. But there is the possibility then, with seeing data like this, to acknowledge that belief and behavior are not the same thing. And separating the two within a person, challenging for sure, but it is possible. And it allows us to have more options, especially in the workplace, for how to address things, how to change, how to have different expectations of one another when we don't have a choice to begin with in terms of who we're working with and who we're engaging with. Back to you, Jean Marie. Oh, no, never mind. Still on me. Sorry. Okay, so one of the other resources that Tannenbaum has is competencies for respectful communication. This is actually one of the additions, one of the resources that we have available within the platform that you all access this session through. And there are 9 things listed. And these 9 things are, I would say, not rocket science, but they're important reminders of how we can interact with one another in ways that allow for, ideally, a positive and certainly a respectful environment. And so some of the things we've touched upon, because again, they're kind of natural or rules, well, I keep saying rules of engagement, but there are elements of interacting with one another that are commonly associated with respect and what respect looks like. So some of these things include avoiding spokesperson syndrome. I could talk to you all day, for example, about what being culturally Jewish looks like for me. I can't speak about what even just generally that same kind of specific culturally Jewish thing looks like for anyone else, because I can only speak about my experience, just as all of us can only speak about our own individual experiences and identities. So consider when talking on behalf of all the Jews, all the Hindus, all the gays, am I actually able to do that, or can I only speak for myself? And that kind of changes the conversation. It changes how we're speaking too, and what we expect from one another. The platinum rule, you might be more familiar with the golden rule, the idea of expecting, I always get this slightly wrong, treat others how you wish to be treated. That's the golden rule. With the platinum rule, it is treat others how they wish to be treated. So the idea behind that is that respect really does look different to one another. We can define it in a manual. We can say this is the definition while we're at this workplace. But at the end of the day, on a daily basis, respect is different for each of us. And the only way we'll know what respect looks like for that other person is asking. And that's a really important aspect of engaging, as we've seen with some of the scenarios we've talked about. And then be curious and ask respectfully kind of leads in a continuation of what I was just saying. That curiosity is totally fine. It's not a problem to be curious and want to know more about people's identities, especially if we're not a part of that community. But there's a way to ask about it that's not, why do you do that? Instead, it could be, oh, that's so interesting. Tell me more about that. And those word choices can really be incredibly critical towards how we come across to someone, even if we intend to just be genuine. You know, we have to be careful on those word choices. Identifying and debunking stereotypes, the usual, don't do it. Try to avoid encouraging others to do that as well. And acknowledge and apologize for mistakes made. This is a really big one, especially in a workplace, especially really the higher up you are in a company, the more people are looking to you to direct what is okay, what behavior is acceptable. And we know we're going to mess up. I have multiple times already in this session, let alone information we may get wrong. That might happen. And we expect it will probably at some point in your lifetimes happen to you as well. And the reality is how we handle that situation is what's even more important. If I schedule a meeting for Good Friday and it's mandatory, I have multiple options for how to approach that. I can continue to hold the meeting that day and acknowledge it to my staff, acknowledge it to the folks who I've required to be present, or I can choose to reschedule it and say, I've messed up, we need to reschedule this in respect of folks who might be observing this day. And similar for any other day of significance. And bonus, you can also share Tannenbaum workplace resources. We have fact sheets about a bunch of different holidays that can allow you to kind of easily say, I'm learning about this information from this resource, and here's some information for all of us to learn about. So things to consider. The image on this slide, it kind of goes against the avoid spokesperson syndrome, but it's too good not to share. It's a group of Christians who are apologizing on behalf of other Christians, saying, I'm sorry that we as a religion have been terrible or not so great to the gay community, and I'm sorry publicly. And it's something that you know, it's not enough on its own, but it is an important step, and we want to acknowledge steps like that. Okay, now back to Jean Marie.
Now I'm allowed to speak. Finally, I can't be quiet for too long. I'm just sitting here jumping around. Although Leslie is so much better than I am. So let's talk about the other tools. So Leslie talked about some of the strategies. So first we talked about understanding our own biases. We talked about breaking out the difference between belief and behavior and how we center those conversations. We talked about these rules for respectful conversation, but part of the other thing is seeking out respectful voices to help with your dialogue. So a lot of times we find ourselves having to have conversations in places and among people that we are not necessarily experienced in or don't have deep enough knowledge in, religious traditions that maybe we don't necessarily understand, or on the other side, you know, people of faith who maybe don't understand all of the stuff about people who are LGBTQ. So there are ways that we should be actively guiding this. I know know a lot of this seems like common sense, but we actually need to be helping people along this journey. And in these moments, important to say these things. So connect with organizations that are providing guidance and thought leadership on this. Obviously, I could say PFLAG and Tannenbaum right now, but that one would seem kind of self-promoting and gross. But there are lots of organizations doing this, and we're going to talk about just a few of those in a moment. It's paying attention to the fact that those resources are out there, and then checking out, how are they talking about these conversations? How are they navigating conflict? What kind of bridges are they building, and what are they using to build those bridges? Because in those spaces, there's a lot for us to learn. There's a reason these organizations are doing this work. The second thing is paying attention to change makers. Earlier, Leslie mentioned different religious leaders that we think are really impressive. I think the way many of these leaders are navigating these conversations is profound, and it is really giving us a model for what these discussions look like inside of safe spaces, faith spaces. I'm going to mention Father James Martin. He's a Jesuit priest. I always talk about him. He's one of my favorite writers. He's doing a tremendous a job talking about the relationships and the acceptance and lack sometimes thereof among people who are Catholic when it comes to the LGBTQ community. But he's doing that work inside of that space, and his resources for people who are Catholic are profoundly effective because they come out of that space. And also know the right places to make those referrals and resources. On the screen right now, we have a list of just a handful of some of the organizations that are out there, and sometimes people don't realize there is there's an organization to represent nearly any faith tradition that you could possibly name, plus LGBTQ people. And I think sometimes actually putting ourselves out there and finding out what these organizations are doing and how they are having the conversations and the resources that they are creating. I was actually at an event about a year ago in those crazy days when we sat next to each other in the same room. And it was a multi-denominational event. And sitting at this table, we had evangelical Christians, we had people who were Mormon. I was on the panel as a Catholic. Every single one of us was bringing resources from our faith communities into the discussion. And most of the people in the room, even though they were very good on these issues, didn't know that that existed. So make sure you are actually leaning into that. Am I still talking? I think I am. When we think about our network groups, we should also be thinking about how do we operationalize this conversation that we're having. So I know we've talked about sort of these more general skills, these how do we interact on a one-on-one level. But as we think about our network groups, there actually is an amazing template for how to get this work done. As more and more organizations have faith-based network groups, and Tannenbaum definitely does some really phenomenal work on that, there are many conversations about how they engage with other groups. And usually the one that comes up first is, as my mom says, the gays. So when we think about those two groups together, right away, most people's heads go to controversy. I think we need to change that tone. I think the bottom line is that people who are LGBTQ exist in faith spaces, and not only do they exist in faith spaces, but our allies and other people who are involved in this discussion, we have shared issues, and we have seen these issues be used to actually help people engage better. So when you're looking at how can you bring people together, every single example on this screen is from something we have seen in a corporation already that worked really well. We talked to one organization that has started a bunch of faith-based ERGs. They were telling the story of how there was kind of hostility with the LGBTQ group. And what they discovered through kind of a random conversation between the two leaders was that both leaders had a history with losing people to suicide. And that because of that, it was a shared issue. As a result, these two network group leaders decided to do a joint program between their ERGs, and that is how they came together. And programming has continued as these two groups come together. But there is so much shared space, and I think we need to work in those spaces and put ourselves in those spaces and say, listen, we both care about this. Let's get together and do this. And when we're together, let's talk. Because it is when you see the other person, when you're packing a bag of oranges at the food pantry, that suddenly that person next to you who's holding the bag is not the other. They're your work partner for the day. And that is where change starts to happen. It may not be the full change you want, but it is those moments of sowing that doubt that maybe I saw the other person the wrong way that really matters. So examples of this: food and toiletry drives, education programs. We mentioned that mental health awareness one. Volunteer days, a lot of those happening right now because of the nature of what we are currently in. Disaster relief, fundraising, shared diversity inclusion forums, so where we have multiple identities coming together. Panels where people are sharing stories. Some of the most profound stories that I have heard have been those stories in workplaces of how people came to be allies to someone else. And that is certainly very, very, very true in the faith space. Sometimes it's just a matter of showing up. I think one of the most impressive things that we continue to see is people from the other network group showing up and supporting events for the other group. Just being there, showing that you care enough to be present is a step in the right direction. That is opening that door. It may not be the conversation, but it's the beginning. And jointly celebrating religious holidays and even LGBTQ historic events. There are many common shared individuals that we have, and that is our opportunity to do these things. So let's work in the positive space rather than start with, why don't we get along? And let's talk about that one. Let's talk about why we do get along and why we actually are more similar than different. And with that, I'm going to also give this back to Leslie to talk about a few things to keep in mind.
Great, thank you. So when we talk about this work, so at Tannenbaum, we talk about it as better practices, not best practices. Everyone's starting at a different place. We acknowledge that. So this is some of the low-hanging fruit, as we like to call it. So what that means is incorporating interfaith calendars, such as the two that are recommended here, including, I think it's the Harvard Divinity School that can be integrated into Outlook. So double win for that. And just having that awareness, encouraging colleagues, at least HR, to have this information, to have it in place so that when you're planning conferences, when you're planning meetings, even virtual sessions, that you know that you have a resource to look to. You have that information already and can plan accordingly. And of course, you can always ask individuals about it and what's relevant to them, but to have something to start with can really be a powerful starting point to acknowledge something that's important to colleagues, something that's important to clients, and can have a really positive long-term impact on those relationships. When it comes to eating, so I guess this is slightly less relevant in COVID times, but for the future, and maybe as you reflect back on when this has happened, a simple question asking if there are any dietary restrictions in advance of a conference, a meeting, any sort of event that involves food, asking if this, just the general dietary restrictions question reflects on religious dietary restrictions, and it also includes, with its broadness, anything about allergies. It provides space, certainly if people feel comfortable, to say that they're fasting, whether that's for Ramadan or for other purposes, not necessarily asking why, just asking, is there anything for us to consider? And then once that is asked about, having something on hand to actually address that. So not saying, okay, sorry, vegetarian person, now you can just eat lettuce, but saying, okay, we went out and actually got you something beyond what we normally do. Or person who keeps kosher or halal, we procured the proper meal in order to meet that need. And again, these are small things, but for people who are often not asked these questions, not used to being considered, to being accommodated, this can really go a long way. And incorporating that into common practices is a really big thing as well. In terms of communicating, again, basic, but respectful communication can really go, can take people far. So engaging in that curiosity, but doing so respectfully, asking for clarification and doing so respectfully. Those competencies for respectful communication, you can easily download them, send them around. Just a reminder, here's what we want everyone to do, things like that. And again, going back to what Jean Marie was talking about before, resources. This is huge. Know where to turn, know who to ask, and just consider that asking for that help can actually be beneficial for you and your community, your workplace community. It's not a sign of weakness or reflecting something you don't know. It's knowing when to ask for help, and that's a really important step to take. And we go along here. And this continues to build on to what we were talking about, what Jean Marie mentioned a lot about, and I think really just what we've spoken about throughout this session, leading with knowledge and understanding. We know it's a journey. That's the whole shtick behind diversity, equity, inclusion, right? But it's real. It's a journey for a reason, because we're all people. We all have different lived experiences, and we all have different different paths to take to get to the point where we can say we're active allies for ourselves, for our colleagues, for our families and communities. So doing so involves all of this. It involves connecting with organizations that can support you and your colleagues. It involves turning to those resources that Jean Marie showed before, or others that might be able to support you and colleagues additionally. And who are the people talking out there? Who are the people who are saying the things that we all need to be listening to? LinkedIn is a really great resource for some of this, and also just Googling around, seeing who exists, asking Jean Marie and I, who's out there? Who do you recommend for talking about any particular subject? We might not know the answer. We also might have people to turn to, who we can direct you to as well. And this, again, it's like a wrap up. It goes back to what we were talking about before. People can be a part of the LGBTQ plus community and be people of faith. It's amazing. We are full of nuance as humans. And yet it's something that we don't automatically turn to. It's not something we think about or assume. It's not something we start with when we're engaging and interacting with one another. So let's change that. Let's do something about that, even if it's in our own mindset or with our own bubble of interaction, the people we're around. And again, super powerful the way Jean Marie put it, so I'm not even going to try to reiterate that. But really, at the end of the day, progress really depends on you and each of us.
And one of the things that I just want to mention as we're getting into applying the skills, and this is about the time where everybody else gets to work and Leslie and I get to sit and pretend to be teachers, is that in these conversations, it is really, really critical that we start owning the language that we are using and preparing ourselves for these discussions. I just want to mention this again as we go into this last part. I want to acknowledge that we are having this conversation at a time in which this discussion is potentially more difficult in some respects than it has ever been before. Not because progress hasn't been made, but because we are in, at least here in the US, and this is true in many other places, an incredibly polarized situation. Because of that, we are more likely to use words to refer to people in ways that we fundamentally know that we should not. And I understand where that comes from. It's really easy for me to call somebody a bigot. It's easy for me to call somebody hateful. It's easy for me to call somebody a fake Christian, because those are all my judgments that are coming out of a place where I've been hurt very badly by people of faith. On the other hand, I know that every single time I do that, I'm making this conversation more difficult for somebody else. My momentary satisfaction has just made this a more challenging discussion elsewhere. So really pay attention to what is flying out of your mouth. Behave better than the people who are your opposition would necessarily expect. If my mom were here, she would remind us that when they go low, we go high. And then I'd roll my eyes like a spoiled child. So we are actually going to go to interaction. So Jamie is going to be coming back to help us with this one. But I want to, we're going to give you a couple of scenarios we're going to talk about. Now, when we get to the questions that we have about each scenario, this is sort of not random. We want to think about some of the skills we talked about today. So keep in mind, what do you need to be assessing when it comes to your own biases or the lens you're bringing into the conversation? What respectful communication skills can you deploy in these situations? So what are some of the things that you think may be done or something like that? And also, if the scenario is something where you think, oh my goodness, I bet you that if I could hand somebody this resource, it would be a big help, or if I could go to a group that represents this particular group, there might be something. Let's talk about those things. And Jamie, how about I read off scenario one or the highlights, and then you'll navigate that one. This one's a little bit long. We wanted to make them complicated because, as we've all learned in 2020, life is super complicated. So here we go with scenario one. So a colleague has indicated they're starting their gender transition, affirming their female gender identity. Most people have been supportive, offering words of encouragement. A few had questions, but one member of your team, Richard, seems very uncomfortable. As Richard's supervisor, you ask at the end of a weekly one-on-one with him if he'd like to talk. When he starts speaking, he tells you he's very uncomfortable with his colleague's announcement. While he doesn't wish her any harm, he certainly doesn't support what she's doing because it conflicts with biblical text that establishes God made man and woman, and the two just can't change because they want to. So he hasn't said anything that is outwardly hostile, but he's told you that he's very uncomfortable. And he said that he doesn't really like this, and that he actually finds it offensive that he is being asked to accept his colleague's lifestyle choice. So this is a really big question. It's a complicated one. What we want to know is, how would you handle this situation? And let me zero in on that and say, where would you begin the conversation? And for your feedback on that, which Jamie is going to share, we're going to ask you once again to use that chat.
I need to remember to unmute myself. This is a scenario where we are going to give folks a little bit more time to think, because it's a complicated question. Somebody has called out that they would go to the code of conduct for the company, and sort of make that differentiation between behavior and belief. You don't have to support to be respectful. Somebody mentioned that they would say to Richard, you know, your feelings are valid, and I appreciate how honest and how candid you're being. A lot of folks are calling out that focus on behavior instead of belief. People are saying that they'd ask some clarifying questions. Can you tell me more about what you're feeling? Can you tell me more about why you are so uncomfortable, those sorts of things. People would focus on the firm's values, the values of giving everybody the ability to bring their whole selves to work. Focus on that behavior belief. I don't really see anybody that's saying I would challenge his biblical perspective. Some folks are saying I'd share specific stories or parables or resources, but not I'm going to tell him he reads the Bible wrong. And lots of folks are saying, you know, I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to rely on resources that exist with my company, and I'm going to show Richard some empathy.
I think that's really impressive, because this is a hard one. This is a very hard situation, and I can say as somebody who aspires to be an ally to my trans and non-binary friends, when I hear somebody speaking like this, I know that it makes me very upset and even angry, I'll admit it. And as a person of faith, it's frustrating to me. So we heard some really interesting things. We heard people who said that they'd rely on the code of conduct, which again, going into the behavior versus belief, validating what he's saying, that what he said and the way he said it, you know, it took some courage for him to say, even if you didn't like what he actually had to say, but he was clear about it. And he frankly was not. I mean, we've seen some really horrifically hostile situations. This was something that could still be managed. Looking at the firm's values, offering resources, but a lot of people talked about asking questions. Why do you feel that way? Could you tell me a little bit more about how this is going to play out for you? Leslie, I wanted to check in with you and see, what do you think you would do? What would be your first step on this one?
I mean, I feel like folks were really listening, not just to us, but to each other. I'm really impressed, actually. I would say I typically expect that people would be less willing to hear such statements. And I think what we would say is probably very similar, to hear what's being said, to acknowledge that Richard, as everyone in the company does, has a right to his feelings and beliefs, and there's no official judgment on that, and that this is a safe space for him to speak, to talk to the supervisor about it, rather than, you know, yelling about it at the office or sharing on the intranet or something like that. So I think that listening would be a really important space to start, and then asking him what he thinks he would need. What does he need moving forward? Also, so that he can feel supported, even if it's not exactly to his liking the way things will move forward, so that he can know that he was heard and supported in that extra way.
I'm also going to say, he did in this scenario, Richard actually does something that kind of puts him a little bit ahead of the curve in a lot of such situations that I know I've been called in to help with. If you notice, he actually said, you know, he doesn't wish his colleague any harm. He refers to her as her. He is validating her transition, which to me says that he's a little bit ahead of where sometimes I think people could be. But this is a perfect example of where it would be very easy to, you know, roll your eyes, say that that's an unacceptable belief, that this is the way it is. And while that may be true for you, it certainly would be true for me. It is not necessarily the conversation that should be happening here, that this in fact is about Let's talk about how you're feeling, and then let's reiterate how we're going to react, how we're going to treat each other, how we're going to behave, and understand that you can feel whatever you're feeling, but the expectation is going to be here.
Yeah, Jean Marie, I wanted to call out one more thing that did come up in the chat multiple times, so I just wanted to sort of put it out there. A couple of folks did note that, you know, if you did get into a situation where Richard was not behaving as kindly, was not sort of honoring and respecting that this is a situation that you might need to elevate to HR. And I want to call that out. It's not what's anything that we know from the scenario as stated, but people did call out, you know, if it gets to a point where he is violating the code of conduct or the employee handbook or policy, that it might be something that you need to elevate. And that is probably going to be true sometimes as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm glad that people mentioned that. I mean, we didn't see anything here yet that required that, but that absolutely is something. Let me be clear, I'm from Jersey. We're not messing around. If you want to violate the rules, we can have a conversation. And it's going to involve HR, which is not my problem because I'm not HR. Sorry, HR people, your lives are very difficult. Leslie, want me to read this one out and then we'll have a talk? Or do you want to
that sounds great.
Okay, so scenario 2. James, another manager at your organization, you're both on the same level, so you become friends, often supporting each other's projects. You often occasionally socialize outside of work. Your backgrounds are different, but she's been friendly. During lunch today, she tells you about a situation that happened that morning. One of her employees has requested 2 additional days off that are related to her Wiccan beliefs. Quote, I don't even know what she's talking about with that lesbian witch religion, Jane commented. I've been very accepting of her, but this just feels like too much to ask of me. So there are 2 questions involved in this one, which is first, how would you respond to Jane's comment? And what issues do you think are at play here? And I'm going to mention, we actually did bring in an example with Wicca because at Out Equal, it's come up several times, and we all need to recognize that not everybody is a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim. There are other religious traditions that are represented in the workplace. And so, Jamie, we're going to use the chat. Leslie, any initial gut stuff that you want to mention on this one?
I want to build off of actually what you said there about recognizing other belief systems, because one of the things that we frequently end up speaking about through conversations at Tannenbaum is what to do with the atheists or what to do with the agnostics. Where do they fit into the equation? Should we be worried about them? Should we be worried about the Satanists? And these are very real questions that are fascinating. And what we really advise is don't worry, because as the rules at your company likely state, be inclusive of people of all faiths and none. Or if that isn't explicit, groups are created, whether it's a faith-based group or any other sort of employee resource group, is created in order to support folks and also provide support for the company. So if anyone of any faith tradition or belief system is acting not in support of people, then that is a problem, regardless of who they are or what they believe. So reiterating that in any sort of communication is a critical piece. So that's moderately tangential to this rather than actually directly about this situation, but it's come up frequently enough that I wanted to take the opportunity to mention it. But what first comes up with this is, it's interesting, but the fact that Jane and her colleague are both they're on the same level. There's not a managerial, like managing someone else here, and so that may be relevant towards how this is approached, towards where HR will come into play, if at all, because it can be just a casual conversation, like, hey, what's going on with that? Why would you say that? And so considering some of the less formal ways to approach it, that's what comes to mind for me first.
Thank you. And I'm glad that you were able to expand upon the conversation about getting outside of those religious traditions that we typically talk about. Jamie, what are we getting in the chat about this one?
Yes, so lots of people are saying in a variety of different ways that in this particular situation, they would start by asking Jane a bunch of questions of like, wait a second, why are you calling Wicca a lesbian witch religion? Do you understand how that might be offensive? I'm surprised you would use language like that, to try and break apart where that sort of harmful language is coming from. A lot of other people are saying in various forms that one of the things that they would encourage Jane to do is a little bit of research on Wicca and sort of neo-pagan or pagan belief systems, so that she has a better understanding of what is going on. A couple people have called out that, you know, if their organization or if their company allows floating holidays to be used for other religious celebrations or events, that Jane shouldn't and couldn't be in a position to deny this person the days off that they need to celebrate and live their religious beliefs. And lots of people, I really are focused on that language of like, why do you think that that all Wiccans are lesbians and witches, and like, where does that come from? Can we break that apart? Let's have a conversation, because that language doesn't feel great, and at work it's especially not okay, but even in your personal life, you shouldn't be making broad assertions like that about whole communities.
Thank you. It's very hard to sometimes keep a straight face, but again, this conclusion actually has been made by some people, which makes it technically not funny. So as we look at how we can handle this, a lot of really important things came out, but one of them goes right to something that Leslie talked about earlier, which was the debunk stereotypes. When we talk about the Tannenbaum rules for effective communication, right there, that lesbian witch religion comment is highly problematic. And I think that it is something, you know, what do you mean by that? Where did you get that idea? I think make Jane actually start to think about what just flew out of her mouth. And not in a mean way, but if you're going to put it out there, it is subject to getting questioned. I think a lot of people, the comment that I'm going to ask a lot of questions is really important, because looking at this situation, my gut says Jane has had some sort of experience that has colored her approach to this discussion, and that is really a tough one. And I also think the idea of equitable application of your policies. So if there are, you know, days that people can use for observation of religious holidays, reminding her that this is in fact a religion, and that that policy applies to everybody, not just the religions that people necessarily feel comfortable with or think are not lesbian witch religions. Mind-boggling. Anything else we want to add on that one, Jamie, that popped up, or Leslie?
I just want to add also, in talking about taking time off for religious purposes, maybe your company is actually super advanced and says taking time off for days of significance or important days like that. So in that case, even more so, it's explicitly stated, basically don't judge, just allow as long as there's no issue for work purposes. So consider the terminology on all sides with that.
That's a really, really good point. Thank you. And I don't think we've ever mentioned that one before, but that's such a great way of phrasing it. Thank you. I learn something every time we talk. So scenario 3, this one is our mega scenario. So we have 2 characters in scenario 3. We have Blaine and Sam. So Blaine is a manager at your organization. He identifies as an out gay man. He's not had issues with his identity, except for with one of his direct reports, Sam. Sam sometimes uses terms Blaine finds offensive, like the gay lifestyle, even though Blaine has discussed that these things are messed up and upset him in the past. So Sam identifies as Jewish. He attends synagogue. He keeps kosher. He's been with the organization 15 years. He's requested high holy days, which so 2 days off for Rosh Hashanah, 1 off for Yom Kippur, plus leaving early the day before. The scenario that we have at hand is this: the day before Yom Kippur is a huge board meeting, and Sam's work is at the center of what's going to be presented. Blaine declines Sam's request and notes Yom Kippur is on one day and he can attend services then. He doesn't need to leave early the day before. Sam's angry that the request has been denied and immediately comments that the reason he's being forced to work is that Blaine is opposed to his religion. So here's the question. Do you think Blaine handled the situation appropriately? And beyond the yes, no, we'd love to hear what you think worked or what went off the rails. And Leslie, any initial sort of gut reactions on this as people's conversation gets started?
Well, this kind of messes with the stereotypes, which is really what we wanted to do. So I want to call that out here in case you of the audience are not seeing it in that way. And I think it's important to understand, I mean, to ask more questions. Really, we don't give all the information that we want people to consider here. So what are the policies? was Blaine even aware of the proximity to Yom Kippur? Was Blaine involved in scheduling? So I have more questions certainly as a reader than I do advising on this, but it is, yeah, I do think it's an interesting one because I would say Blaine did not handle it very well. And yes, I know I'm Jewish in saying this, so I'll acknowledge my likely bias to it. But I think that's part of the complication too.
My non-Jew gay side says that Blaine totally blew this one too. So I'm not sure if religion had anything to do with it. Jamie, what are we hearing in the chat?
So there is a little bit more sort of disagreement, if you will, in this one, where some people think that Blaine did not do the right thing, that it was not communicated well, that perhaps if he had explained to Sam why on this particular day that he wasn't handling it well. But other people are calling out that there's some responsibility on Sam to explain the significance of the holiday for him. A lot of people don't know that Jewish holidays start at sundown on the day before, and if he knew that this was going to be a conflict where Yom Kippur was going to fall on the day of a very important meeting, that he should have been communicating that more in advance and doing the work and prepping someone to sort of take on responsibilities if needed. So we're seeing lots of different responses, folks that have disagreement, that Blaine as the manager should have done more to prepare for something like this to happen in advance. Perhaps Blaine should have looked at the calendar and not scheduled a really important board meetings when one of his direct reports was observing a religious holiday. That there's a whole lot going on here.
One of the things that I think is very interesting about this one is when you get to that last bullet, that Sam's angry that his request has been denied, and he thinks that it's because Blaine's opposed to his religion. I bet you that if we had a conversation with Blaine and Sam, both of them at some point would probably suggest, based on what we know here, that what's going on is that the other person doesn't like them because of something related to their identity. So both of them are probably harboring some ideas related to the other's identity and what they think that the other person thinks of them. And there's a lot of unknowns there. What we know is that there is kind of this history of hostility, so it suggests that people might be going to that. But in fact, there actually are some pretty clear-cut procedural things going on here that could have been navigated a whole lot better on the part of both Blaine and Sam. So this is one of those ones where we need to acknowledge that sometimes these unresolved conflicts that we have around religion and identity in the workplace can actually get bigger and bigger. And then when a situation happens, they can become a contributing factor in the conflict that we are experiencing, which actually may fundamentally not have a lot to do with that. Initially, it actually has to do with the way we are handling ourselves. The point is, this is really super complicated. And this sort of brings us to getting into our Q&A. And I want to remind everybody that if you have questions for us, we hope we have answers, but please put those into the chat. Jamie is cataloging those so we can spend the remainder of our time. We've got about 15 minutes chatting. And my point where we leave this off is this. I think many people assume the issue needs to be that we are balancing everyone's issues very evenly, and that can be done cleanly. But the truth is, it is not clean, and it is not easy, and it is more than just religion and gender identity and sexual orientation. There are many conversations happening here as we bring ourselves into these discussions about age and ethnicity and race and the kinds of ways we have been raised in religious environments or not. And I think that that's really critical to understand too. So it is not always a clear path forward. We started by saying there is no detangler. There's no detangler, but there certainly is product and things that we can do that we know that make this far, far less complicated. And so with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to throw our contact information up on the screen. Just to let you know, if you want to contact us, we certainly would love to talk to you. But with that, I'm going to turn it back to Jamie to do questions that we have from today's participants.
Yes, and because it is 2020, you may hear my cat screaming to be let outside over the next couple minutes. If you do, I apologize. One question that came up pretty early, and this is again because it's 2020 and this is the world we live in. Somebody was wondering if either of you have tips on having and creating conversations with those folks in your life that literally won't listen to anything that doesn't conform to their belief system, even like facts and like documented evidence. Do you have any tips on sort of having or creating those conversations in a productive way?
I'm going to throw out my one thing. I literally have one thing, and it's very interesting because I had this conversation with a really good friend a couple of nights ago, who's having some real challenges with a family member whose religious beliefs are frankly hurting him. I think, you know, when you get past the facts, when you get past all of your statistics and stuff, the one thing that has been effective to me, and it hasn't necessarily solved everything, is really connecting for people of faith the harm that is done by some of their behaviors. I believe, and I have been very fortunate to have this experience, to be with people of faith who were really struggling or maybe even opposed, but who, as they understood that what they were doing was literally hurting people. I mean, it was literally causing people to leave churches, to experience self-harm or participate in self-harm. Really connecting those dots, I've seen movement. I believe that if you are truly a person of faith, if you truly are, knowing that something that you have done has made someone feel alienated from God or from their deity is a profoundly upsetting fact. And I think that is where some of it is. So for me, it is for me talking about how I was super fortunate to be raised in very accepting Catholic communities. And yet some things that have been done to me in Catholic spaces have caused me to feel the need to leave Mass in the middle because I actually felt threatened. And a lot of people don't hear those stories. So that's my take. Leslie, I don't know if you, and you probably do, have some more stuff that you would build onto.
Well, honestly, my first question or thought is maybe not the most helpful, but it is why? I mean, is this a conversation that you want to have or that you feel like is really necessary? And I don't say that truly from a judgmental place, but really evaluating, is this a conversation that is beneficial to you? Can you make or do you feel like it's worth considering a decision of not including this person in your life? And I know that's a big decision and maybe not my place to say, but I think it's worth considering in this crazy world we live in, that our mental health is really largely impacted by the people we surround ourselves with. Sometimes that's from virtual spaces, but I would recommend if the person who you're trying to communicate with isn't hearing you, then at some point it really is kind of like banging your head against a wall, and it's not actually in furtherance of your own well-being. And I would recommend considering that. Maybe if it's not at that level, taking a step back and considering the way in which the choices you're making around communicating, you know, using things like I statements, I feel this way, rather than using the you are doing this, you are the problem. Again, it's like what I was talking about before with the competencies for respectful communication, where it sounds simple, but it's kind of amazing the impact it can have depending on the interaction with the person. So those are two extreme options, I think, but something to consider as well.
I think you're right, Leslie. In the interest of self-care, I mean, there is a point at which you probably should stop subjecting yourself to being hurt. And that's really difficult. I have had to take people out of my life because of this, and it doesn't feel good. But sometimes it's the best thing to do. What else do we have, Jamie? Mute. Jamie, you're on mute.
Unmute. I remuted myself. I was just doing great. Another question that came up reasonably early in the session, and Leslie, is something that you started to talk about a little bit as we were going through one of the scenarios, but somebody was wondering if you have any recommendations for making atheism or a general sort of lack of belief a bigger part of the conversation about faith.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think part of it, I mean, it depends in a lot of ways, and apologies, going to law school means it depends is always the best answer before anything else to supplement that. But it does depend, because are we talking within a faith-based ERG? Are we talking about how to include it within a group or a space that's already dedicated to supporting people of faith? And in a space like that, that's pretty specific, what sort of terminology is there in the group's mission? You know, does that include being inclusive of people of all faiths and none, and maybe encouraging that what we find is that folks who might identify as atheist, agnostic, or even very broadly as nothing in particular, as spiritual, so many different labels that we can put on ourselves, let alone that are put on others and us. But in considering all of these, folks who have different belief systems like that might have just as strongly held beliefs as someone who is affiliated with a religious tradition. And that's just a reality. And it doesn't mean that we have to understand or really relate to that, but just acknowledging it. So I think maybe having a conversation, again, about the behavior, so about the terminology associated with a faith-based ERG's mission statement and about that terminology. If it's a question of, again, like if it's in a broader space, if it's with HR, what is the terminology? What is being done to acknowledge it? And where possible, recognizing that changing language to being inclusive of people of all faiths and none can really be powerful and can just make people wonder, like, oh, what does that mean? And it's not saying we condone everyone's belief system, because that's not what we're talking about, but it's we welcome people who believe a variety of different things, don't believe some things. We want to be a space that everyone is accepted in whatever way that looks, whatever acceptance looks like. So it's almost a non-answer, I acknowledge, but it's complicated for sure.
I think I don't think that was a non-answer at all. I think that the language that you're offering is so useful. And I found that even at PFLAG, we've started using that language too, and it is really effective. I just want to add one thing, because this has come up a lot for me personally in these interactions, is reminding people that people who identify as atheists or agnostics, it does not mean they don't have beliefs and that they don't have moral systems, that there is no ethical structure by which they function. And I think those of us who are people of faith need to start saying that more often, because I feel like people who don't necessarily adhere to any particular religious tradition often get marginalized as some sort of, the implication is some sort of crazy sociopath. And in fact, they are in many cases some of the most thoughtful people who have had to really think about their moral beliefs and their ethical structures because of the lack of a religious influence. And I think it's an opportunity for us to do some inclusion work right there.
Yeah, and I just started waving. My cat tried to make a cameo for those who requested, but I started waving because I am one of those people. I identify as an N-O-N-E, a none. Like I don't even identify as an atheist, because I think about faith and religion and the existence of a creator so infrequently that I don't even feel the need to have a way to describe myself. Really, like I'm legitimately a none. And I like to think that I have ethics and morals, and that that I treat my colleagues who do have religious beliefs or are part of a faith community with respect. And that's why I started waving, just in case anyone was wondering. And I'm sorry if you didn't see the cat cameo, because we tried, but he's being a nutball. The very last question that I have been able to sort of call out and write down in my notebook, somebody was wondering if you have any recommendations or connections or resources for folks that are doing this type of work in Europe, at the intersection of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, and faith. Do you have any recommendations?
I'm just going to jump in on the LGBTQ side. I would definitely check with LGBTQ organizations in each country. Most countries do have a big or a significant LGBT group that does a lot of work, just the way we have here. We sourced Stonewall several times during our session. They've done some really great work. So I'm just talking on the LGBTQ and faith side. I would check with what is available from organizations in that country, because there's some really great stuff, but sometimes it's not always sort of widespread available. But Leslie, I'm sure you have stuff, because you do a lot more work in that space than we do.
Yeah, I mean, I think Stonewall's a really good reminder. They do have a faith section as well, which is awesome. Just that it exists is pretty exciting. And One of the things that we do find is that a lot of companies, multinational companies with locations all over the world, have these faith-based ERGs and or pride ERGs too. And we're finding that this conversation of if a faith-based ERG exists, let alone if a company should explore that, it's happening more and more during COVID. Companies seem to be more willing to acknowledge the relevance and the support that an interfaith employee resource group could provide for clients. So to a certain extent, I would say see what exists at your company. And the other thing is that some companies based in these different countries do have a presence that could support other companies. We're finding there's a lot of that cross-company collaboration. I think that's the word. And I think there was actually a session about that during Out and Equal. But it's also, if there's a specific country in mind, Tannenbaum, I don't mean to just tout our resources, but we do have resources, and also feel free to be in touch because there are different companies that we could refer you to. There are companies that even just doing work around religious diversity within non-US spaces, it's kind of rare. And so it's exciting when companies are doing that work. And so I know within France, there's an organization that, of course I'm blanking on the name right now, but they do work around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And they are a nonprofit as well. And again, if people are interested in this half information that I'm providing, please be in touch with me and I can actually provide the full information. I'm sorry, I'm just blanking on the actual resource, but I'm happy to be in touch and to talk about it further with folks to see what we can do to provide that resource, connect you with people who do have that resource.
We're just going to say it's 2020 and everything's upside down, and that's totally okay. And there's our email addresses. I believe this gets us to the end of our session. Leslie and Jamie, thank you so much. It is always the best thing in the whole world to be able to be presenting with you two. Everybody who participated, thank you so much for joining us today. Please reach out to us. We'd love to talk more about how we might be able to support you. Thank you for everything that you're doing. You are changing the world. I am brokenhearted that we are not seeing each other in person, but I'm really, I'm going to say I'm personally praying that we are all together and able to hug again next year. So thank you. Please be safe. We are going to remind everybody that you should be wearing your masks. I have my Wonder Woman one ready. So wear your mask and we hope to see you really soon. Thank you for everything that you're doing. Take care of yourself. Bye, everybody.